One's going to be in Vancouver, but I'm not in Vancouver. I'm in Toronto. And my wife, Bev, and I have come to Toronto to, of course, celebrate Passover with our family, all of whom are here. But the prelude to Pesach was our granddaughter Violet's first birthday party, which was today. So I'm just coming back from having had the pleasure of our granddaughter's first birthday party, our first grandchild and her first birthday. So a bunch of milestones. But here we are on the cusp of Pesach, and I'm sure you, like me, have been getting ready and doing all the things that need to happen. And so we have been today going out shopping in the Madhouse. In Vancouver, it's not a very large Jewish community, so there really isn't so much of a sense of something is happening when there's a Jewish holiday. But here in Toronto, it's like something is happening. And the supermarket was full of people, many of them with beards and kippahs. So it's also with the knowledge that Pesach is coming up that I chose the topic that I did, which is we're going to talk about acquiring Torah. But there's a story behind that, and some of you will be somewhat familiar with this because if you were in the Kiyum program that we did a few years ago, or if you were a member of the Mussar Institute last year when we were at the same time of year, we did a program which drew on similar material. The same time of year is looking through what's coming up, the two Siddharim, and then at the second Seder, that evening, is when we begin the counting of the Omer. And last year and in previous years, we did an Omer-based program. And that program was really it was founded on a practice that was done in the Kelm Yeshiva in the 19th century. Now, we're going to do it again this year, but we're doing it a completely different way this year in that we're making it just really brief and putting it up on a blog, which will be available to our Facebook page, or if you are a member of the Mussar Institute, you'll be getting a daily email through the Omer period. But all of this is based on, that was all just to say you may be familiar with this to some extent, but what I'm really pointing to and drawing on is a particular Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. That's the 6th chapter and the 6th Mishnah, which provides 48 methods for the acquisition of Torah. That's exactly what it says, Kinyei HaTorah. To make a kinyan is to make an acquisition. Liknot in Hebrew is to purchase. So you're really making an acquisition of Torah. And that particular Mishnah contains 48 methodologies. Now, in the counting of the Omer, there are 49 days. So what they did in the Kelm Yeshiva is that they would spend one day on each of the methodologies that are involved in the acquisition of Torah. And on the 49th day, they would review. So you had a practice a day. Now, the basis for that, or what that stands on, I want to link together both this Mishnah from Pirkei Avot, but also the Omer period. What they both relate to is what I think is really a very fundamental aspect of Judaism, and really is the theme of my new book that's going to come out in August, which is that from the perspective that I have, which I would say is one perspective on the entire Jewish tradition, that what the Jewish tradition is concerned with is our own personal change, the personal transformation of a human being from someone who is basically pure potential into somebody who really realizes a great deal of what the tradition says is the possibility that a human being can be. And in the Mussar interpretation, that draws on Torah to say, what is it that a human being can be? And drawing from Torah, the answer is holy. Drawing from the Mussar tradition itself, the answer is whole. To be whole. And there's no real difference between the two. That to be holy is to be whole. You can't be holy when you are partial. There needs to be a completion in order to be holy and whole. And I really think that that really is an underlying theme of everything that the Jewish tradition wants of us. That all the rituals, all the liturgy, all the festivals, all the enormous weight of what Judaism has built up over the 3,500 years has within it a dimension which is all about personal change. And when we look at Pirkei Avot and this particular Mishnah, we'll see that what we're being given is 48 methods of personal change. I'll come back to it. I'm going to focus on that, but I want to put a couple of other pieces into place. One is Pirkei Avot itself. The name of this book in the Mishnah, Pirkei Avot, is almost always translated as Chapters of the Fathers. A chapter in Hebrew is a perek, and Pirkei is the plural, the smichut, the combined plural form. Avot is from Av, which means fathers. So to translate it as Chapters of the Fathers is completely accurate. It's not the only translation. Av in Hebrew and in Jewish thought also means a first principle. Like there are 39 labors, 39 kinds of work that one is not supposed to do on Shabbat. Each of these 49 is named an Av Malacha. It is the father of this labor, and then you have subcategories. And the subcategories are called toldot, which means generations. It's like it's being cast in a genealogical form. We sometimes talk about a tree, that there's the trunk of a tree, and then there's branches of the tree, and this is the center, and this is the branch. But that's only a metaphor. And similarly, in Jewish thought, what you find is that different metaphors being used, and the metaphor is one of a parental generation and then the children of that. So one of the malachas is not to grind. You're not supposed to grind. And then there are all the subcategories of grinding. So immediately thinking about the fact that Judaism was formed in a time when the Jewish people were an agricultural people, then you can immediately think about grinding wheat or grinding flour of some kind. And that would be a very basic time. But when it comes down to our era, and I think probably most people's houses have a pepper grinder. Well, pepper grinding is also not a Shabbat permitted activity because grinding pepper is a tolda. It is a second generation iteration of the first principle, which is the grinding principle. Now, I'm not talking so much, I'm not meaning to talk much about halakha, except that's the model that this draws from. Because what it does is it causes us to reinterpret the title of this book. The book is no longer to be called, in my language and my thought right now, I don't call it Chapters of the Fathers anymore. Because if you call it Chapters of the Fathers, what you're doing is you are, in a sense, just saying, this is traditional. This is from my ancestors. This is nostalgic history. It comes from the past. But the other way of translating is Pirkei Avot means chapters of root principles. Chapters of root principles. And if you call it that, then it's no longer about the past, it's entirely about the present. And not only about the present, it's about the root principles of the present. It's about the spiritual principles that our ancestors, in fact, were the ones who isolated them. But what they passed on were not just the teachings of old generations, hoary, spider web covered, but they were passing on root principles. And if you look at Pirkei Avot, sure enough, what's it full of? Basic principles. Teachings which talk about the essence of life. You know, who is rich? Who is wise? Who is mighty? Et cetera, et cetera. So many teachings in Pirkei Avot that are about the essence of human life. And what we get then in this particular Mishnah 6.6 is we get a grouping of practices, 48 practices, which are real root practices. They are core practices for the transformation that Judaism wants us to make. And I really believe that. I think that in the spirit, in the creation, in the structure of the Jewish tradition, there is a emphasis on personal transformation. These 48 methods are methods of transformation. The notion of acquiring Torah is a notion of transformation. The idea of the Omer period is an image of transformation. Let's talk about that one for a moment, and then I won't talk about the Omer anymore because we're going to go into the actual text. But the point being that we do it at this time of year. The Omer marks the passage from the liberation from Egypt to the giving of the Torah in Mount Sinai. It goes from Pesach to Shavuot. It is a journey. It is marking day by day by day the 49 days that we historically went from leaving Egypt to reaching Mount Sinai and receiving the Torah. That in itself marks a journey, and it marks a transformation from slaves to free people, from people who were at the depths of impurity, because that's what's said about the slaves in Egypt, that there are 50 gates of tumah, of impurity. And after those hundreds of years of slavery, that the Jewish people had sunk to the 49th level, in the sense of such impurity. And then, at the other end of this journey, we find people who are completely transformed, completely purified. There's a description of the purification that goes on, and that it made the people worthy to receive the Torah. So, such an image of change from impurity to purity, from debasement to holiness, that is the marching of the Omer. It shows up elsewhere in the Jewish tradition as well. This is really something I'm seeing. Once you get an idea, I shouldn't say you, I should say I. Once I get an idea in my head, sometimes I start to see it everywhere. But the clearest example is actually a different set of festivals in the fall, which is Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are entirely about personal change. All of the things you take responsibility for, and you make amends for, and you have regret for, and you pluck all faith for, you can't see me, I'm beating my chest, that all of that is about change. It's about taking responsibility for the things that were in the past, making amends where necessary, feeling regret, making resolutions to change, and actually changing. If that's not what Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are about, I don't know what they're about. The liturgy is clearly about taking personal responsibility for who you are, for what you've done, for what you've said, cleaning up the mess, if there is a mess, and then continuing with that journey of personal change. I feel, this is a footnote, but I feel that if that element of the Jewish tradition is missing, not to say it is what the Jewish tradition is about, but if that dimension is missing, then I think the Jewish tradition, as somebody might experience it, is incomplete. Because if we are talking about a core theme of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we're talking about the Omer period, Pesach, Shavuot. Between Pesach and Shavuot and Sukkot in the fall, we've got the three main festivals of the year. And that really strikes me as being a piece of what the Jewish tradition has always wanted from us, that has been some of what has been lost or de-emphasized. Whereas I think that many of us would gain so much if what we could draw from our Jewish tradition or Jewish heritage is a sense of guidance, root principles, the chapters of root principles. And we know that this is something that has been passed down for about 2,000 years. Although the Mishnah was codified around 200 in the current era, but the sixth chapter was added a little bit later. But still, centuries and centuries and centuries of people who have found these to be root principles. And so it is for us. So what does it mean to acquire Torah? That is the topic of this session, and it is the focus of the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. Now, we know what Torah is, both narrowly and widely. Narrowly, you could say the most narrow definition of Torah is the 5 books of Moses. We've got the Chumash, starting with the creation of the world and going right through the death of Moses and then the coming of the Promised Land. The understanding of Torah, though, is much broader than that, even in reality. I mean, that's called the written Torah. But then there's the oral Torah. And the oral Torah includes the Mishnah and the Gemara, which make up the Talmud. And then you've got other forms of teaching and writing, which also come in under the Torah. You've got, besides the 5 books of Moses, even within the Torah itself, you have the writings and the teachings, the books like the Megillot of Esther and Ecclesiastes, and you have the prophets, all the teachings of the prophets, Isaiah and Ezekiel, and so that's still Torah. And then you've got the Mishnah and the Gemara and the Talmud, and then you've got Midrashim and so on. So in reality, Torah is a very broad concept, and within it is all the teachings of the Jewish tradition, which have been in some ways canonized, which have become part of the main body of tradition that has been passed on from centuries. What does it mean to acquire Torah? We know that this is the breadth of what we have inherited as a wisdom tradition. What does it mean to acquire Torah? It can't mean to learn Torah. It can't mean just to learn Torah. You're not going to be able to acquire Torah without learning Torah. But it was immediately apparent, and I have a great proof for it, that the rabbis who composed this list of 48 practices were not saying that this is the equivalent of learning Torah. There is something different in acquiring Torah, because the first of the 48 is learning Torah. It's Talmud. Now, if the first method is learning Torah, and there are 47 methods that follow behind this, then clearly what we're talking about when we talk about acquiring Torah is something other than learning Torah. 2 points about that. One is, again, this reflects the Jewish thrust to personal change. Because a person can learn, I was going to sort of acquire again, but I acquire information in that sense. A person can learn a great deal of Torah and have it not touch them deeply within. Have it not become part of who they are in their deepest inner being. That's possible. It's possible to learn Torah as a purely intellectual exercise, in which case you can do all kinds of party tricks. You can quote chapter and verse, you can quote commentaries, you can relate words to other, you can do all kinds of things that show intellectual gymnastics, but it hasn't gone deep enough. And I think that's why the rabbis make the distinction between learning Torah and acquiring Torah. Now, they make learning Torah the first of the 48 because that is the starting point. I mean, Torah may be broad, but it is also defined. These are principles and ideas and ethics and spiritual notions. All that fall very clearly within the Jewish mainstream that you first need to learn and then fit them into yourself. Let it sink in, that it becomes part of who you are. The acquiring of Torah is a step beyond the learning of Torah. So the first step is learning Torah, but then we have to go beyond that in order to take what we've learned and process it in such a way that it becomes who we are, so that it is so intrinsic to our being and so intrinsic to our perspective and our worldview that we are transformed by the process. That's what acquiring Torah is. And that's why the rabbis use the word acquiring and not learning. Because what they're concerned about is you becoming a living embodiment. We becoming, I'm not excluding myself. Though everybody in the Jewish world is being asked to become a living embodiment of the teachings of the Torah. So that when we read something or we learn something, it doesn't remain mere intellectual information. That it becomes part of the living truth of who you are as a soul. A couple of examples for that would be humility, for example. To know all the laws or all the characteristics, to be able to define humility to the very finest degree does not mean that a person's humble. And in fact, it can exactly indicate the opposite. Somebody could be very proud of their intellectual knowledge, which allows them to define humility so perfectly that they actually become proud of their ability to do things like define humility. And the same thing would be true of something like generosity. That a person who can cite all 10 levels that Rambam laid out for the giving of tzedakah, that there are 10 levels of tzedakah, or if you can quote the laws from the Shulchan Aruch and whatever it may be, that where you're learning the laws of tzedakah, is that going to cause a person here to be open-handed? Is that going to do it? And the rabbis, going back now to early centuries, said, no. If you don't learn, you'll be an ignoramus. If you just learn, you'll be an intellect. You have to go one more step, which is to acquire Torah. And to acquire Torah, there are methods. And the rabbis give us 48. And of those 48, we've touched on one, which is learning. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the other. The reason that I want to talk to you about them is I want you to understand and appreciate and be enthusiastic that as you get information going through the Omer period, each day you're going to get one of these teachings. And I want you to be enthusiastic about it so that you can actually do it. And that implies, and it is quite correct, that when we send the teachings to you, we're not only going to be sending a brief paragraph or two about the methodology that the rabbis gave us for acquiring Torah, but there will be a practice. And my strong encouragement here at the cusp of the Omer period is for you to do the practice. And so I've mentioned learning, and I don't think you'll have much trouble coming up with an example of what it means to learn. But if we go on to the second method, remember, what are we talking about here? Methods for acquiring Torah. Then the second method already gets into root principles, and you'll see what I'm talking about, and we'll explore this one a bit, and you'll see the practice that's involved. You'll see what's being made available to you here. Yes, it's being made available to you through the Mussar Institute, but really what's being made available to you is this set of root principles that has been encoded in Pirkei Avot. One is learning. Number two is Shmiat ha'odin, which I translate as attentive listening. Ozen is ear, and Shmiat is from the same root as Shema, which means to listen. So a listening ear, or listening of the ear, Shmiat ha'ozen, listening of the ear. But that's not a very idiomatic phrase in English to call it listening of the ear. So I translate that as attentive listening. And what that means is that you can learn something, but you have to listen to it. You have to hear what's going on inside the words. One of the disabilities that I think is really rife in our world today is that there is so much noise, there is so much sound, and there is so much noise even of a non-oral kind. It's like just very hard to really listen to depth. And it's really funny because Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who started the Mussar movement in the 19th century, he wrote to his students, and in one of the first letters he wrote to his students, he said something which I can remember hearing from my own mother, which is he said, everything that I've said to you seems to have gone in one ear and out the other. And he was upbraiding them for not listening deeply. I had an incident recently which I'm still chagrined about because I had done, in the last month I did 2 scholar in residence weekends, and one was in Dallas and one was in a suburb of Philadelphia. And a woman came up to me in Philadelphia, I think it was, and she said, what do the Mussar teachers teach about reincarnation? And she kind of asked it like that. What are the teachings on reincarnation? So, me, in the teaching mode, which is what I'm there for, slip into teaching. I tell her about reincarnation as I've learned about it, as it exists in different teachings in the Jewish world, things that Rabbi Pear said to me about reincarnation, and then making the distinction between reincarnation and resurrection, which is a big distinction in the Jewish world, Jewish thought, and so on. And I can see I'm not really having that much of an effect on her. I'm really not. She's listening, but kind of not showing me that I'm hitting any bullseyes here. And then that conversation rolls into something else, and she goes away, and I'm with other people. And one person says to me, what was behind that question was that woman's son had committed suicide earlier this year. And I was devastated because I really didn't listen, and I really didn't set up the situation to listen. Because what I did was, I kind of shut down the question. I bludgeoned the question with information. How much different it would have been if I had heard within her question another question. I didn't have to guess. It's not about having psychic power. It's about saying, why is this woman asking me about reincarnation? And the approach, the much more attentive listening approach, would have been to say to her, what's behind your question? Why are you asking me that? What's your insight? If I had set it up so that in the first instance, I listened to hear if there was something behind the question, but then I created a situation so that I could hear if there was something behind the question, that then I would have really been hearing her at the level of the heart. And there's another story also of a very similar kind, but related to Pesach. You may have heard this story, that a man came to the rabbi and said to the rabbi, Rabbi, is it permitted at the Seder table to have 4 glasses of milk instead of 4 glasses of wine? And Rabbi Mussar said, are you doing this because of illness, or are you doing this because you are, allergic to wine, or what's the motive for it? So in fact, you can see already this rabbi took a very different approach to the one I had taken, because this rabbi was asking questions in order to hear deeply what was going on. And the man answered honestly. He said, no, the issue is that milk is much less expensive than wine, so I would like to have milk. I just wonder if that's permitted. So the rabbi went into his rabbi's discretionary fund and gave the man 25 rubles. And after the man left, the rabbi's wife said to him, why so much? If you were just trying to provide him with wine instead of milk, it didn't take 25 rubles. He said, if he was planning to have milk, he wasn't planning to have meat, he probably doesn't have any of the necessities of the Pesach Seder. And so what was within that question about using milk for the Pesach Seder, because this rabbi had the capacity to listen deeply, that he could hear that there was something inside the question, and then he was able to respond really to what was going on that was real, which is exactly what I failed to do with that woman now just 2 weeks ago. I mean, that was a very recent story for me. And I felt after hearing from someone else that I was 100% right, that I had been 100% wrong, that I really had not listened deeply. So we see an interesting thing in the progression as we look at the second of these methods of acquiring Torah, is that there is an attention to the emotional and the experiential learning that we can do by listening. The first method is learning. So you learn something, and then you have to listen deeply into it to hear what the essence of it is. And sometimes what you find is that within the essence, the real message lies. I'll just give you one more example, then I want to talk about the practice. And then we'll do a couple more examples. Very often when people deal with the old Mussar text, they find themselves what I call bouncing off the surface. They have a hard outer coating. The language, the values, the assumptions about the world were perhaps formed in a ghetto in Germany in the 16th century, or an Arabic-speaking Jewish community in Spain in the 12th century, or a Kabbalistic community in Sfat in the 17th century. Of course they're coming from a different world. And of course they're going to have assumptions in there and cultural elements that are alien to us. That's the surface of the book. If you only listen to the words as they are at the surface, and you don't listen deeply into what's behind the words, you can miss the whole message. Because the message may entirely apply to you, or it may entirely apply to me. But if I'm saying, look how he speaks about women. Look how he speaks about non-Jews. Look how this book, I have to dismiss this entire book because there are values being expressed here that are alien to mine. And that's not attentive listening. That's not listening deeply to say, I don't have to accept all the values or the assumptions or the principles of cultural life that were true in 18th century Germany or Hungary, but I have to listen deeply. So when this comes around in the Omer practice, on the second day, so this is actually going to come to you on Wednesday night of this coming week. We're going to send out the first one before Pesach, because in the diaspora, the Academy of Omer starts at the evening of the second Seder, which is Chag time, so we don't do email on Chag time. So we have to send out the first one in advance before the first Seder. And then the second method comes out after the 2 days of Chag in the diaspora are over, and then you're going to get this teaching on attentive listening and a practice. Now, you should appreciate that for most of us, being an attentive listener is very difficult in our world to go slow enough, to be perceptive enough, to be sensitive enough, to care enough, to go. You can see where this will be a method for acquiring the wisdom of Torah. Because if you treat Torah superficial, then it can't possibly penetrate into the core of your being and take residence in your heart. So here's the practice that you're going to get on Wednesday. Everyone has something to teach you. It could be your formal teachers, or maybe the FedEx driver, or the cafe waiter. Everyone you meet is a holy soul, a neshama, imbued with elements of wisdom of his or her own. If you listen, if you incline your ear. So the usual translation of Shmiat HaOzen is to be a careful listener, and to be careful is to be attentive to the details, but also to be full of care. So your assignment for the day, if you want to make the most of the second day of the Omer, is to be a caring listener, caring about what's being said, not being superficial and not being judgmental and not putting up blockages, but listening deeply so that you can hear the wisdom. There's a teaching it's actually of Rabbi Simcha Zissel, the author of Kelm, when the question is asked in Pirkei Avot, who is wise? And he says, and the answer in the Mishnah is one who listens, Mikol Adam, which is usually translated as from everyone. Who's a wise person? One who can learn from everyone. But Mikol Adam can also mean from the whole person. Learning from the whole person. Because somebody may be really a bad person in some way or a flawed person in some way, but there's no doubt they have wisdom to teach if you pay attention to the whole person and not the fact of what may be the hard shell that you're bouncing off. So on day 2, we go on to Shmiat HaOzen, to have a listening ear. And it's so interesting that in the 3rd day, so this will come out on Thursday of this week, we turn around to Arichat Tifetayim, orderly speech. If you want to be a person who acquires Torah, you have to speak in an orderly way. This is actually the last one I'm going to get to, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the table of contents, and then if there are any questions, we can talk about that. Because I just want to give you the flavor of how much there is of value so that as we go into the Omer period, we really get the most of it. For the sake of the transformation that is the driving force of Jewish practice, not just Mussar, not just Jewish spiritual practice, but the whole programmatic aspect of what a Jewish life is about. Orderly speech. And this means that you put your words in order. And that can mean one of two things. It can mean that your words are clear, coherent, and intelligible. You know, the Jewish tradition, it's not surprising that it follows in the book that listening is followed by speaking. Because it is to speaking that we really need to listen the most. But the Jewish tradition puts such an emphasis on speech as being not just functional, and not just even a defining feature of being a human being, which it is, but, and there are many sources that point to that. But it goes beyond that because, as you will recognize, God created the world with what? With speech. You know, the 10 Commandments. If you know the Hebrew for the 10 Commandments, it says nothing about commandments. Aseret HaDibrot. Aseret is 10. Dibrot, Diber, is speech. The 10 speakings, or the 10 utterances. God spoke, and we know that. That's the way the Torah actually describes it. God spoke, and the first couple, the people heard, and then after that through Moses heard these utterances, because that's the power of speech. God created through speech. And, you know, that's the Aramaic formula that a magician uses. Abracadabra. Abara, I will create. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, bara, God created. I will create abara ke vibara as I speak. I will create as I say, abracadabra. What I say will come into existence, which is all from the same sense, a word of diber, that the 10 speakings are at its core. So the Jewish tradition places this enormous emphasis on speech, and there's so many other examples of it. But what makes our speech orderly is our inner intentionality. We can be sloppy in our speech, we could be misleading in our speech, we can be destructive in our speech. You know, it says in the Jewish tradition that the life and death is in the power of the tongue. And it says also that Lashon Hara, negative speech, causes the death of 3 people. The one who speaks it, the one who hears it, and the one who it is spoken about. So, on the one hand, with speech, we have a sense of its majesty, its miraculousness, its magicalness. It is a property which God used to create the universe. It's all that, and it has a terrible destructiveness to it. It is a murderous implement. It can cause so much harm. And what makes the difference is that sense of orderliness, which can mean, as I said, that you say what you think. Your words are properly ordered. But there's another sense as well, which is that the order of our words lines up with the divine will. That we are ordering our words according to principles. And those principles come from the ethical and the commanded teachings of the tradition, so that we have a sense of a reference point. And we bring that reference point into our speech, and so we end up with speech that is beneficial and creative, not the negative speech of Lashon Hara, of that which destroys. Rav Kook, who was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel, who lived from 1865, died in 1935, talks about the way in which you start to see your speech differently as you go through your own spiritual elevation. Come back to the principle of Judaism being a pathway of personal change. As you walk that pathway, you start to, I suspect everybody who's hearing me tonight, seeing me tonight on this webinar, has had some direct experience of this. As you engage with Mussar, you see the changes in yourself. As you see the changes in yourself, you feel them. You realize a change is really happening. It's not that somebody else tells you, it's that you experience it. And I'll come back to Rav Kook, but in the middle I'll insert a quote from Rabbi Yechezkel Levenstein, who said, "The purpose of a human life is to purify and elevate the soul." Another metaphor for transformation. The purpose of a human life is to purify and elevate the soul, which is the same concept Rav Kook brings, because he says, as the soul is elevated, we become acutely aware of the tremendous power that lies in our faculty of speech. We recognize clearly the tremendous significance of each utterance, the value of our prayers and blessings, the value of our Torah study, and of all our discourse. We learn to perceive the overall impact of speech. We sense the change and great stirring of the world that comes about through speech. So the more spiritually elevated you become, the more you will experience that speech has this duality. It has the capacity to be almost a divine quality in the way we have the capacity to use it, and it can be so destructive and so negative. And it's up to us to organize our speech in order to make that happen. Now, if we go and look at what the practice is, so on Thursday your practice is going to be, and I'll read right now from what will be sent out. The act of verbalization has power. It clarifies ideas and concretizes concepts, turning them from fuzzy mental notions into a reality in the world. When the Mishnah says that your lips are to be orderly, that means that you should take care that what comes out of your mouth lines up with your values and your ideals. In this period, this one day, pay special attention to everything that comes out of your mouth and weigh every sentence to ensure that it carries into reality only your highest aspirations. Now, imagine that you live like that. I mean, I just read that and I said it to you. Pay special attention to everything that comes out of your mouth and assay every sentence to ensure that it carries into reality only your higher aspirations. Everything you speak represents your higher aspirations. Only that. Tremendously powerful idea and practice. Taking that wild monkey of speech that we use to just chatter, 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 almost as if there's no mind behind it, like it's disconnected. The mouth runs, but the mind is not in gear. And recognizing the tremendous power in organizing our speech. This, too, is a method for acquiring Torah. It's a method of becoming the kind of person who is a living embodiment of Torah. First, you have to learn what are your highest aspirations. Where did you get them from? Are you sure? So there's a learning and a developmental process to say, I can state my highest aspirations. I gave you an example. If you were to embrace Rabbi Yechezkel Levenstein's formula, he said, the purpose of a human life is to purify and elevate the soul. That could be a higher aspiration that you attest to. You make that a principle of your life. And then all your words line up against these higher aspirations. So what we have, those are just a few examples, is 48 messages are going to be coming at you soon, and they're going to come fast. There's going to be one a day. And you're going to be invited to look, read, something brief, but more important than that, practice, so that you bring into your experience each of these methodologies. They're not meant to be restricted to the owner. This is our teaching. This is a course. This is our period of intense study. But studying should be a 52-week of the year process. Attentive listening should be something you do with everybody you meet. As I said, the FedEx person and the cafe waiter. Listen. You'll learn. You'll connect. You'll be there. You'll be present. Practice in being present. Orderly speech. And then we go on. And in the other methods, I'll just read some of them to you, so you understand how profound this is and how valuable and what an opportunity you are about to embark on. Understanding of the heart is number 4. Fear is number 5. The practice of fear. Awe, humility, joy, serving the sages, closeness to friends. I love that. I love that Jewish spirituality going back hundreds and thousands of years talks about the transformative impact of being close to friends. Debating with students, Yishuv da'at, to have a settled mind. And then there are more, and then there's a whole section here that comes number 15 through number 20 is minimizing. They're all minimizing. Minimizing sleep, minimizing conversation, minimizing engagement in business, minimizing pleasure, minimizing mundane activities. You can understand each of these things is not bad. Pleasure is good. Mundane activities are required. Business, who can support themselves without making money in some way. But what's your main value you're living for? What's the direction you're going in? Is it to sleep more? Are you living to sleep more? And again, unless you understand that some people really do need to sleep more. Some people have insomnia. Some people have sleep disorders. That's not true for the majority, and this is what is being addressed here. The majority of people can tend to be lazy, can tend to be self-indulgent if we have the opportunity. And then there's a whole other section which comes later, which is all about love, about being beloved, of loving God, of loving God's creature, of loving uprightness, etc. And so we go through 48 methods. So we go through 48 steps, 48 days, coming to the 49th, which is the day of pulling it all together, and then on to Shavuot and the receiving of the Torah. That's what the festival of Shavuot represents. These methodologies are all about preparing oneself to acquire Torah. If you're a person who just indulges in sleep, you're not getting yourself ready. If you're a person who judges other people negatively, you're not getting yourself ready. These are methodologies for preparing the human being for the acquisition of Torah. What does it really mean to acquire Torah? I don't know. Because I don't know how one also becomes holy. I have good sources for that. Because Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto says in the last chapter of Mussar Institute of Path of the Just, he says, the search for holiness is his own holiness. The pursuit of holiness begins with work and ends with a gift. It's not the outcome of the work. You have to do the work, and then the result comes, but you can't say, I did the work and I earned the holiness. He says it comes as a gift to one who does the work. It means there's no guarantee. But what's in our hands to do is the work, is the practice, is the transformation the Jewish tradition shines such a big light on and shows us the methods of going. And so, in a few days, tomorrow, we're going to get the first of these 48 methods. And I encourage you to see it in that light, as a way of going, as a way of laboring, as something you can do to purify and elevate your soul. Some of these will speak to you, some of these more, some of these less. I encourage you to take some time each of these days to invest in the practice that's being made available to you. That's the work you can do. That's the toil. My hope, my prayer, also my faith, is that by doing that you will receive the gift. That's what the tradition talks about, receiving the gift. And it is the only way that I've heard that seems to make sense to me to make oneself ready and available for that gift. So I'm going to invite anybody who has any questions to type them into the chat box. Now, how am I going to see the chat box? Okay, here we are. I get a muzzle puff, so I know the chat is working because I get a muzzle puff from Jeff on Violet and the entire family. I should actually upload, as a proud Zeta, I should upload a photo of Violet, but I don't have one handy at the moment. So, if there are any questions, then I will take them. If not, maybe it's time to light your candle and go do the Deket Chumetz. I hope I'm looking at the chat in the right way. I think I am. Yes. So Jeff Amer says Happy Passover, which is very nice, Jeff. I appreciate that. I also appreciate this confirms that the chat is working. I wish you a happy Passover too. Again, it is the same sort of thing. Here we are at the Passover. It says in the Haggadah that we should experience the same as if we ourselves are leaving Egypt. And that's, again, the kind of practice that leads to change and transformation. If you race through the Haggadah or skip the Haggadah or skip Pesach, you miss the whole practice. You miss the benefit. You miss the internalization. And so I hope that you will, in a way, take even the meta lesson, the higher level lesson of all this teaching, which is to take the wisdom that's being offered and take it in so deeply that it becomes part of who you are. It becomes the living truth. So I don't see any more questions. I do see a muzzle puff and wishes for a happy Pesach. And so I will also wish you a happy Pesach. And I hope that the Omer period this year really is transformative, and that by the time we all get to Shavuot. By the time you and I reach Mount Sinai, we will have purified and elevated our souls and prepared ourselves to be new people. A lot to be said about that, but that's really my wish, and I wish you Chag Kasher v'Sameach.